Some dangers announce themselves not with violence, but with a whisper that chills the heart. It begins with a letter slipped beneath a door in Hampstead, warning that among 3 women, one shall not live to see the month's end. From that moment, Holmes and I were drawn into a web of jealousy, deception, and shadows beneath the old elm. Where are you tuning in from, and what time is it? Let me know in the comments. Now, let us unravel the threads of this perilous intrigue together. It was in one of those rare intervals of calm which occasionally visited our tumultuous existence at Baker Street that I found myself once more appreciating the simple comforts of domesticity. Holmes had, for some weeks, been engaged in no case of moment, and I confess that I relished the leisure afforded me. The crackle of the fire upon the hearth, the rustle of the evening paper in my hands, and the faint aroma of Holmes's pipe lent a quietude to the sitting room, which was almost unfamiliar to us. My companion, stretched languidly in his chair, seemed sunk in some private chain of thought. His piercing gaze turned not upon me, but fixed absently upon the ceiling. In such moments, I was ever struck by the contrast between his restless energy when engaged upon a problem and his peculiar lethargy when deprived of it. His genius, I reflected, was like a finely tempered blade, either flashing in brilliant strokes or else lying idle in its scabbard. The hour was late in the afternoon, and I had resigned myself to an evening of undisturbed tranquillity, when suddenly the world, as so often happened in that singular household, was turned upon its head. The sharp rap of a knocker below, followed by hurried steps upon the stair, shattered the repose of our lodging. Mrs. Hudson, with a face of mild consternation, announced a lady who insisted upon immediate admittance. In another instant, the door opened to admit a figure whose very presence dispelled all thought of calm reflection. She was of middle years, but the anxiety written upon her countenance lent her a more fragile air. Her dark gown was of good quality, though travel-worn, and her gloved hands trembled visibly as she clasped them before her. Holmes, ever alert to such manifestations, had risen from his chair before a word was spoken. "You come in some distress, madam," said he, with that courteous gravity which he reserved for the suffering. "Pray be seated. My friend and I are at your service." The lady sank into the armchair opposite Holmes, casting a quick glance around the familiar room as though the very walls might lend her reassurance. Her lips moved, but for a moment no sound issued forth. Then, with an effort that seemed to summon all her strength, she began the tale that was to embroil us in one of the most singular affairs of our long association. "My name is Clara Ashbury," our visitor began, her voice tremulous yet determined. "For the past 3 years, I have shared a residence in Hampstead with 2 dear companions of mine, Mrs. Eleanor Grant and Miss Lydia Harcourt. We are bound together not by blood, but by friendship of long-standing and mutual support. Ours has been a household of quiet harmony, though each of us bears her own history and her own trials." She paused, drawing from her reticule a handkerchief with which she dabbed her eyes before continuing. "Eleanor is of resolute nature, having been left a widow some years past, and it is largely her means which support our home. Lydia, by contrast, is of a more sensitive and romantic disposition, often the target of unwanted attentions from gentlemen who misconstrue her kindness. For myself, I had thought our arrangement one of peace and security. Alas, that illusion has been most cruelly shattered." Her hands clenched more tightly upon the kerchief as she spoke. "For within the past week, events have occurred which point to some hidden malice directed against us. We know not from whence the threat arises, but we live now in a state of dread, unable to pass a night without fear that some calamity will befall one or all of us." Holmes inclined his head slightly, his grey eyes fixed upon her with unyielding intensity, as though already divining the truth concealed within her words. With a sudden motion, Mrs. Ashbury drew forth from her reticule a folded sheet of paper, yellowed at the edges as though much handled. She placed it with a trembling hand upon the table before Holmes. "This was delivered in the dead of night," said she, her voice faltering. "Slipped, it seems, beneath our door. When we discovered it upon the morning, its message was plain and terrible." Holmes unfolded the missive with deliberate care. The writing, bold yet curiously uneven, proclaimed in stark terms, "One among the three will not live to see the month's end." The words had been written in a dark ink which had bled faintly into the fibres of the page, giving them an almost spectral appearance. A more direct menace could scarcely be imagined, I observed, for the chill of the words seemed to seep even into the warmth of our firelit chamber. "Indeed, Watson," Holmes replied, his tone as calm as if he had remarked upon the weather. "Here we have both malice and intention. The question remains only of means and identity." Mrs. Ashbury's composure faltered, and she pressed the handkerchief to her lips. "We are three defenceless women, sir. If such a warning is sincere, what protection have we against its fulfilment?" Holmes's gaze lingered upon the sheet before him, his mind already far from the immediate scene. It was at such times that Holmes's faculties, which to the casual eye appeared languid, revealed themselves in their full keenness. He examined the letter, not with haste but with a singular concentration, holding it delicately to the light, then bringing it close to his face. "The paper is of foreign manufacture," he murmured, half to himself, "the ink of a cheaper sort, prone to blotting. And observe, Watson, the hand that penned these words is left-handed, for the smudging here runs distinctly to the right of the strokes." I bent over the page but could discern little of what he indicated. Holmes's finger traced the margin, then fell upon a faint mark. A tear, ragged, as though caused by some abrasion, and yet upon the glove of our visitor. Here he turned his penetrating gaze upon Mrs. Ashbury. "I perceive an identical imperfection, as if both letter and glove had been caught upon the same obstruction." Mrs. Ashbury started at his remark, but Holmes pressed her with no further inquiry. Instead, he laid the paper upon the table with a look that suggested he had already gleaned more from it than she or I could begin to surmise. Holmes leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "You perceive, Watson, that the threat is neither idle nor clumsy. It bears the stamp of calculation and of intimate knowledge of these ladies' circumstances. Such an adversary is to be taken seriously." Turning once more to our visitor, he said with quiet firmness, "Madam, you and your companions are in peril more immediate than you suspect. We must lose no time in placing this matter under close scrutiny. Delay in such a case might prove fatal." Mrs. Ashbury's pale face blanched still further, and her hands trembled afresh. It was upon the following morning that Holmes and I set forth for Hampstead, summoned by the urgency of Mrs. Ashbury's appeal. The weather had taken on that melancholy cast so familiar in London's autumn, with a thin mist clinging to the streets and the bare branches of the trees rattling like bones in the wind. I confess that the sombre air lent itself most unhappily to the case before us, for it seemed as though nature herself had conspired to heighten our sense of impending mischief. Holmes was in one of his more silent moods, answering my observations only with a brief word or gesture, his eyes fixed upon the shifting fog outside our cab. I knew better than to intrude upon such concentration, for these periods of abstraction invariably preceded some dazzling stroke of reasoning. As we ascended the gradual rise toward the heath, the streets grew quieter, the houses larger, and the impression of seclusion more complete. There, amid the stillness of that suburban quarter, we were to encounter the strange household in which three women, bound by friendship and necessity, lived under the shadow of a most sinister threat. The house to which Mrs. Ashbury directed us stood upon the very edge of the heath, a large and respectable dwelling of darkened brick, its tall windows half veiled by ivy that clung stubbornly to the stone despite the season. To my eyes, it presented a picture of sober comfort, yet there was something in its very stillness which struck an ominous chord. Perhaps it was the way in which the path leading to the door was overhung by leafless branches, or the faint echo of our footsteps upon the flagstones that set my nerves on edge. Holmes paused before we entered, casting his keen gaze over the frontage, the garden gate, and the upper windows, as though even in that instant he might glean some clue invisible to my less discerning sight. "A house that has known recent disquiet, Watson," he murmured, though he offered no further explanation. Within we were received with courtesy, though I could not fail to note the hush that lay upon the place, as if every sound were muffled by apprehension. The hall was well appointed, yet there lingered in it an air of suspense, as though fear had taken up residence among its very walls. We were ushered into a sitting room where the three companions awaited us. It required but a glance to discern the striking differences of temperament which distinguished them. Mrs. Clara Ashbury, whom we already knew, was as nervous as before, her eyes darting to every shadow, her hands twisting ceaselessly in her lap. She greeted us with a look of mingled relief and dread, as though fearful of both what we might discover and what we might fail to prevent. Beside her sat Mrs. Eleanor Grant, a tall woman of commanding presence, whose widow's garb only seemed to heighten her natural air of authority. Her expression was one of resolute calm, yet I sensed beneath that composure a spirit steeled against adversity rather than untouched by it. She spoke little at first, but her very silence conveyed strength. In contrast, Miss Lydia Harcourt appeared almost ethereal, with fair features and a manner tinged with melancholy. There was about her a softness, a susceptibility to emotion, which rendered her particularly vulnerable to the terrors of the situation. She clung to Clara's hand as though seeking reassurance, and her glance at Holmes was one of imploring confidence. Holmes inclined his head to each in turn, his manner at once respectful and penetrating. Though he uttered few words, I could see from the glint in his eye that he had already begun the delicate process of disentangling truth from fear and fact from imagination in this curious household of three. It was not long before we were introduced to the other members of the household. A maid of middle years entered to provide refreshment, yet there was about her an air of reticence which impressed itself upon me at once. She moved softly, spoke sparingly, and cast glances that seemed more furtive than respectful. It was the manner of one who held some private knowledge, or who resented her station within the house. Scarce had she withdrawn than another figure presented himself, a man whose features bore a striking resemblance to Mrs. Grant. This was her brother, Mr. Henry Morton, who had of late returned from abroad. His countenance, marked by lines of discontent, betrayed a bitterness that even courtesy could not wholly disguise. His greeting was perfunctory, his tone edged with suppressed irritation, as though our presence were a source of intrusion rather than relief. I observed Holmes regard both with his calm, unblinking gaze, though he asked them nothing. Later, I was to appreciate how swiftly his mind had catalogued their mannerisms, storing each impression until such time as the pattern of the whole should emerge. To me, the atmosphere within that house grew heavier with every passing moment. At Mrs. Ashbury's request, the letter was once more produced for Holmes's scrutiny. He received it with the air of a man already in possession of half the truth and set to confirm the rest. Drawing it close beneath the lamplight, he examined first the paper, then the script, and finally even the faintest stains upon its surface. "The paper is foreign," he remarked, "of a texture and watermark seldom found in England. The writing, though disguised, bears the unmistakable character of a left-handed penman. Observe how the strokes trail to the right, where the hand has brushed against the still wet ink." He held it to his nostrils with a quick inhalation. "Linseed oil, faint but perceptible. A most uncommon taint upon a letter, Watson. It suggests that the writer's occupation brings him into frequent contact with pigments or varnishes." I bent eagerly over the table but could detect none of these signs. "How you perceive so much from so little is ever beyond me," I exclaimed. Holmes gave no reply, save a slight smile. To him, the letter was not a threat alone, but a cipher whose key lay hidden in the small peculiarities which others might disregard. When we requested further particulars, Mrs. Grant related that several minor disturbances had lately unsettled the household. Doors, which they were certain had been bolted, were discovered standing ajar in the morning. Windows, too, had been tampered with. One in particular bore clear evidence of a forced catch. These incidents might, on their own, have been dismissed as lapses in vigilance, yet in light of the threatening letter, they acquired a sinister weight. More alarming still was the loss of a brooch belonging to Miss Harcourt, an heirloom of considerable sentiment. It had vanished without trace from her dressing table, though she was adamant that it had been placed there the previous evening. The servants, when questioned, professed ignorance, and suspicion naturally fastened upon them, though without proof. Holmes listened to these accounts with the gravest attention, his fingers drumming softly upon the arm of his chair. An intruder who enters unseen, leaves tokens of his passage, and selects his trophies with deliberation, he murmured. This is no idle mischief, but a mind rehearsing its intent. Each small disturbance is but a prelude to a larger act. The ladies shuddered, and I confess I felt the chill of his words strike me also. As we departed the sitting-room, Holmes drew me aside into the hall, lowering his voice. You perceive, Watson, the dual character of these threats. They are contrived with a certain theatrical flourish, the note, the vanished trinket, the disturbed window, all intended to inspire terror. Yet beneath that spectacle lies a hand deeply conversant with the household's private rhythms. It is an enemy, not distant, but near, one who knows the lives of these women as well as they know themselves. I could make no reply, for the thought of such malign familiarity chilled me to the bone. Holmes, however, merely tightened the knot of his scarf and moved toward the door. His eyes shone with that peculiar light which I had come to recognize as the herald of action. The case, though but newly begun, had already seized him in its iron grip. During the days which followed our first visit, we made the Ashbury residence our frequent point of observation. I soon perceived that the sense of unease within those walls had deepened to an almost intolerable degree. Each night brought with it some new disturbance, subtle in execution, yet alarming in its implication. Footsteps were heard upon the upper landings at hours when no member of the household was abroad. A curtain in the drawing-room was discovered slashed by some sharp instrument, though no sound of intrusion had been noted. Most sinister of all, a lantern which customarily burned in the garden was found extinguished on 3 successive nights, though Mrs. Grant swore that she had herself lighted it before retiring. Such occurrences might appear trifling when considered singly, yet in their cumulative effect they preyed upon the nerves of the 3 ladies until their lives became a perpetual vigil of dread. Clara started at every sound, Lydia wept silently over her fears, and even the formidable Eleanor admitted that she could no longer pass the darkened corridors without apprehension. Holmes himself seemed absorbed rather than alarmed. Each fresh incident was received with a quiet nod, as though it fitted into some mental arrangement of his own devising, and I began to wonder whether he already discerned a method in this sinister pattern. Holmes, ever unwilling to confine himself to the testimony of those most directly concerned, set about gathering impressions from the neighbourhood. I accompanied him upon several such excursions, and it was instructive to observe the manner in which he elicited confidences from the most unlikely of sources. A gardener, a shopkeeper, even a child returning from school, all were drawn into conversation by some deft remark or casual inquiry, until presently the desired information was forthcoming. In this way he pieced together a portrait of one whose name was mentioned with a mixture of disdain and pity. A certain Mr. Felix Hargrove, a suitor who had once paid fervent addresses to Miss Lydia Harcourt. It appeared that his attentions, though persistent, had been firmly declined, and that since her rejection he had been observed in moods of brooding resentment. One neighbour declared that he had lately taken to wandering near the heath at unseemly hours, muttering to himself as if possessed by dark thoughts. Holmes listened to these accounts with polite detachment, though I could not fail to note the gleam in his eye when Lydia's name recurred. To my mind, the connection was plain enough. Here was motive born of jealousy, opportunity afforded by proximity, and a temperament soured to the point of menace. I ventured to say as much to Holmes, but he merely smiled faintly, as though amused at my eagerness to fix upon so obvious a suspect. If suspicion at first attached itself to the rejected suitor, it was soon diverted by circumstances which cast an equally baleful light upon the figure of Eleanor Grant's estranged brother. Henry Morton had taken up residence in a small chamber at the rear of the house, and his presence was felt as a constant discord within the already troubled household. His manner was curt, his temper uneven, and his absences during the evening hours gave rise to dark conjecture. More than once I observed him return late at night, his boots soiled with mud, and his face clouded with some private vexation. On one such occasion, Clara, unable to restrain herself, taxed him with neglect of the household's safety. He answered with such bitterness, declaring that he cared little what befell either house or inmates, that the ladies were reduced to tears. Lydia in particular seemed terrified by his harshness, while Eleanor defended him with a loyalty more stoical than affectionate. Naturally, the evidence of temper and opportunity combined to point suspicion in his direction. I confess that I myself was strongly inclined to see in him the author of the anonymous warnings and nocturnal disturbances. Holmes, however, remained unmoved. Surface indications, my dear Watson, are the very snares by which the unwary are most often trapped, said he when I pressed him upon the point. Mr. Morton's faults are plain enough, and therefore all too easily seized upon. That which is most obvious is frequently least relevant. Let us keep our eyes, not upon the hand which flourishes itself before us, but upon that which conceals its motion in the shadows. Thus rebuked, I held my peace, though my suspicions of the man were by no means allayed. Holmes, who had hitherto borne Morton's brusque manner with apparent indifference, at length shared with me in private his impressions of the man. You are too ready, Watson, to accept at face value what is, in truth, but a masquerade of guilt, said he. The fellow is sour-tempered, negligent, and perhaps envious of his sister's comfort. Yet notice how he conducts himself when pressed. His anger is the instinctive retort of a man wounded in his pride, not the measured craft of one engaged in a criminal design. I protested that the lateness of his returns and his visible agitation were circumstances hardly to be explained by wounded vanity alone. Holmes, however, shook his head. On each occasion that he re-entered the house, his boots bore no trace of the heath's distinctive clay, but only the dust of the paved roads. He is restless and dissatisfied, but not the prowler who troubles this dwelling. Nay, Watson, the hand that pens anonymous threats does not squander its malice upon querulous outbursts. Thus, Holmes dismissed the likelihood of Morton's guilt, though he added, with that curious mixture of caution and confidence which was his hallmark, "We shall not discard him from the board altogether. Every piece must be accounted for before the game is ended." The matter, which until then had seemed a slow crescendo of menace, was brought to a sudden climax by an event which might easily have proved fatal. It was upon an evening when Holmes and I were once more in attendance at the house. The ladies had retired early, their nerves strained by the continual alarms, while Holmes remained below in conference with Mrs. Grant regarding certain details of the household's arrangements. I had just risen to fetch a volume from the upper landing when a sharp cry, shrill with terror, echoed through the stairwell. Dropping the book, I sprang forward to behold Miss Lydia Harcourt clinging desperately to the banister, her face ashen and her limbs trembling. At her feet, upon the polished wood, lay a heavy vase which had been placed upon the landing table but was now shattered into 100 fragments. She declared in gasping tones that, as she descended, a figure had emerged suddenly from the shadows behind her and thrust her with great violence toward the stairs. By some providence, she had clutched the rail and thus saved herself from being hurled to the stone floor below. Before either Holmes or I could reach the spot, the intruder had vanished as silently as he had appeared. The household was thrown into the wildest panic. Clara wept openly. Eleanor demanded sternly that her brother explain his whereabouts, and Lydia herself could scarcely speak for sobs. Holmes, meanwhile, examined the scene with tranquil precision, measuring distances, noting footprints upon the carpet, and scrutinizing the fragments of the vase. "This, Watson," he said at last in a low voice, "was no accident nor idle menace. It was an unmistakable attempt at murder." From that moment, the atmosphere of dread within the Ashbury residence deepened to an oppressive weight, pressing upon all who dwelt there. I could not banish from my mind the image of Lydia's pale face, nor the thought of how slender had been the margin between her preservation and her death. The unseen hand that haunted the household had now revealed its murderous purpose, and I, for one, felt the gravity of the situation with increasing force. It astonished me that Holmes maintained his habitual composure. Indeed, he seemed more absorbed than alarmed, his keen eyes glowing with inward calculation, as though the peril itself had supplied the stimulus his intellect demanded. More than once I ventured to remonstrate with him, urging immediate action, yet he only smiled with that air of inscrutable confidence which, in my more anxious moods, I found positively exasperating. "My dear Watson," said he, "the danger is undeniable, but the perpetrator's overhaste has furnished us with more than he imagines. Time is our ally, provided we use it well." Yet I confess that I found scant reassurance in his words. Each creak of the stair, each gust of wind rattling the shutters, seemed to herald a fresh assault. I could not escape the conviction that delay might embolden the assailant to strike again, and that next time fortune might not so readily interpose. Thus my admiration for Holmes's genius warred with a gnawing fear that his very detachment might prove the lady's undoing. At Holmes's suggestion, we sought out a former servant of the household, a maid who had been dismissed some months prior under circumstances of ill conduct. Her lodgings were found in a narrow street off the high road, and she received us with a mixture of sullenness and curiosity. When pressed by Holmes, she did not scruple to express her animosity toward her former employers. "They thought themselves too fine for the likes of me," she declared, her voice rising with passion. "But I tell you, gentlemen, there are secrets in that house, and I could speak of them if I chose." Holmes regarded her coolly. "And yet you do not choose," said he, in a tone which was more observation than inquiry. She muttered something indistinct, her eyes shifting uneasily, before resuming her tale of grievances, her dismissal, her sense of injustice, her resentment at their cold treatment. Though her words dripped with bitterness, there was a hollowness in her threats which did not escape me. As we took our leave, I remarked that her malice seemed sufficient motive. Holmes only shook his head. "Her bark is worse than her bite, Watson. She resents, but she does not act. The true hand at work is one that moves with far greater subtlety." It was on the following day that we paid a call upon Mr. Adrian Verner, a gentleman of some repute in the artistic circles of Hampstead, and known to have maintained a former intimacy with Mrs. Grant. We discovered him in a modest studio, surrounded by canvases in various stages of completion, the air heavy with the odour of oil and turpentine. At first his manner was smooth and urbane, but it quickly became apparent that our visit was not to his liking. He spoke of Mrs. Grant with a studied indifference which seemed too deliberate to be sincere, and when Holmes turned the conversation toward the threatening letter, a faint flush appeared upon his cheek. What struck me most forcibly, however, was the condition of his hands. Though he sought to conceal them in a rag, I could not fail to observe the ingrained stains of oil and pigment upon his fingers. Holmes, with his usual adroitness, contrived to examine them more closely, under the pretence of admiring a sketch. "Linseed," he whispered to me afterward, "fresh upon the skin. The scent we noted before is no coincidence." When we withdrew, I expressed my conviction that we had at last encountered the true culprit. Holmes, however, offered no assent. His eyes gleamed, but he remained silent, as though unwilling to commit himself before the picture was fully complete. That silence, more than any protest, convinced me that we stood upon the brink of some revelation, though I could not then guess its nature. Our inquiries next led us to a solicitor by the name of Mr. Charles Fenwick, whose offices were situated in a gloomy corner near the Hampstead churchyard. He was a man of sharp features and quick, darting eyes, who welcomed us with a courtesy that seemed to mask a certain inward disquiet. Holmes, adopting his most professional air, inquired into his connection with Mrs. Clara Ashbury. After a moment's hesitation, the man admitted that he had managed certain investments on her behalf and that disputes concerning the property had recently arisen. He assured us, however, that the matters were of a purely financial character and bore no relation to the sinister threats which now afflicted the household. Yet, as he spoke, his fingers tapped nervously upon the desk, and I could not help but perceive that his manner betrayed an uneasiness at our line of questioning. There was a subtle defensiveness, as though he feared exposure of something he dared not reveal. When we quitted the office, I voiced my suspicion that the solicitor had stronger motives than he admitted. Holmes, however, was once again non-committal. "He is involved, certainly," said he, "but whether as actor or as bystander we must yet determine. The danger, Watson, lies not in what is spoken aloud, but in what men take such pains to conceal." Thus, with each new figure drawn into the circle of suspicion, the web grew more intricate, and my own mind more bewildered. Holmes alone seemed to discern the threads which bound them together. Holmes, ever attentive to the smallest hint, directed our steps to a tavern upon the outskirts of Hampstead, a low establishment frequented by labourers and obscure tradesmen. Its reputation was not of the best, but Holmes declared that it was there, rather than in any genteel drawing-room, that a clue of consequence might be unearthed. We seated ourselves in a corner, where Holmes, under the pretence of idly smoking, kept his gaze fixed upon the comings and goings of the room. Presently a man entered, his figure cloaked, his hat pulled low, and his movements marked by an exaggerated caution. He spoke briefly with the landlord, then withdrew a slip of paper from his pocket, comparing it with a bundle displayed behind the bar. My curiosity was roused when Holmes's hand tightened upon my arm. "Observe, Watson," he whispered. "The paper, foreign make, identical to that used in the threatening note." The fellow paid for his purchase, received a packet, and hastened away without so much as a glance about him. Holmes rose quietly, and I followed, but by the time we reached the street, the man had vanished into the fog, leaving no trace of his course. "It is confirmation," said Holmes grimly. "Whoever penned those words replenishes his supply here. We have come within a hair's breadth of grasping the hand itself." In the days which followed, I grew increasingly restless, for Holmes appeared more absorbed than ever, yet imparted little of his reasoning to me. He paced our sitting room for hours, the letter in one hand, his pipe in the other, muttering fragments of thought too disjointed for me to grasp. When I pressed him, he answered only with enigmatic remarks. "The matter assumes dimensions of both intimacy and performance," he said once, breaking off abruptly as though he had spoken too much. At another time, he observed, "3 women under one roof, Watson. Consider what complexities of loyalty and secrecy that implies." Then, with a sudden change of tone, he launched into a monologue upon the philosophy of jealousy, leaving me more perplexed than enlightened. I confess that my patience wore thin. "Holmes," I exclaimed at last, "these women live in daily terror, and you speak in riddles. Surely we must act, not theorize." He gave me a glance at once amused and reproachful. "My dear fellow, action without comprehension is but blundering. The trap must be laid with precision, else it closes upon air. A few more strands, and the net will be complete." His confidence was undeniable, yet his reticence weighed upon me. I could not shake the fear that while he wove his intellectual web, the hand of the assailant might already be raised for a deadly blow. It was upon a dreary evening, when the fog pressed thickly against the window panes of Baker Street, that Mrs. Hudson entered with a letter just delivered by hand. Holmes took it with a composure which belied the gravity of its contents, while I, leaning forward eagerly, could scarce contain my agitation. The envelope bore no superscription save our address, and within was a single sheet, the writing bold and uneven as before. Its message was stark. The first blow will fall on Hampstead Heath, under the old elm. I felt a chill run through me as I read. "Holmes," I cried, "this is no longer menace but certainty. We must warn the ladies at once." Holmes, however, sat with the letter held delicately between his fingers, his eyes half closed in thought. "Note, Watson," said he, "the deliberate choice of words, the first blow. Our adversary proclaims not merely an intent, but a sequence. The play has entered its second act." My protest was checked by the grave authority of his tone, yet I could not quell the unease that gnawed at me. That a crime was imminent seemed beyond doubt, and still Holmes withheld his plan as though the time were not yet ripe. For myself, I passed the evening in a fever of anxiety, pacing the floor while Holmes remained motionless, his gaze fixed upon the fire. At length he murmured, "The curtain rises at Hampstead Heath, and it is there that we must take our places." Thus the stage was set for a confrontation which promised either resolution or ruin, and I, for one, trembled at what the morrow might bring. Holmes, once resolved upon a course of action, moved with a decisiveness which brooked no delay. On the morning after the arrival of the second, threatening letter, he called together the three ladies of Hampstead and laid before them a plan, which, though it filled them with trepidation, he insisted was the surest means of bringing their persecutor to light. "You will, this very evening," said he, "attend a charity gathering at St. John's Hall. The household must appear deserted, save for the servants, and thus offer a lure to the prowler who has so long haunted you. Fear not. Though unseen, you will not be unprotected." Mrs. Ashbury wrung her hands, Miss Harcourt wept softly, and Mrs. Grant, though outwardly composed, could not disguise the tightening of her lips. Yet Holmes's authority was such that they acquiesced, trusting implicitly in his judgment. When they had gone, Holmes turned to me with that quiet gleam in his eye which ever heralded the approach of decisive action. "The enemy has chosen the stage," said he, "but the play shall end upon my cue. Tonight, Watson, beneath the shadow of the old elm, we shall see the matter brought to its appointed close." Night had fallen ere Holmes and I took up our station near the ancient elm upon Hampstead Heath. The sky was overcast, the moon smothered by drifting vapours, and the wind carried with it the rustle of leaves like the whisper of unseen voices. The house of the three ladies lay some distance off, its windows darkened, its aspect that of a dwelling abandoned to solitude. Holmes selected our place of concealment with the precision of a soldier laying an ambush. There we crouched, scarcely daring to stir, while the hours crept by with intolerable slowness. My nerves, I confess, were strung to the highest pitch, for every sound, the snap of a twig, the distant cry of a night bird, seemed to portend the approach of danger. Holmes, by contrast, remained motionless, his gaze fixed unwaveringly upon the path which wound beneath the spreading branches of the elm. The very stillness of his figure communicated to me the strength of his resolve. At length, when my patience was nearly spent, he whispered, "Steady, Watson. The curtain rises. Observe yonder shadow." And indeed, far along the path, a dim light had appeared, wavering and uncertain, yet advancing steadily toward the appointed place. As the light drew nearer, its bearer was revealed to be a solitary figure, cloaked and hooded, moving with that cautious tread which speaks of both guilt and determination. The lantern, shielded on three sides, threw a narrow beam before him, while his own form was swathed in darkness. Each step brought him closer to the elm, and with each I felt my heart hammer more violently against my ribs. Holmes, beside me, betrayed no sign of agitation. His eyes shone keenly, and his hand rested lightly upon my sleeve, as if to restrain me from some premature movement. The figure paused beneath the elm, setting the lantern upon the ground. For a long moment he stood motionless, as though listening for some signal. Then, with a sudden motion, he raised his hand as if to beckon or to strike. At that instant, a carriage drew up upon the road, and from it descended Mrs. Grant, who had been persuaded by Holmes to feign a return from the gathering. She had scarce set foot upon the path when the shadow moved toward her, his hand outstretched in menacing haste. I uttered an involuntary cry, but Holmes's grasp tightened upon my arm. "Not yet," he whispered. "The snare must close at the very moment of the stroke." The lantern's glow caught the assailant's features, revealing for an instant the pale and eager face of the gentleman artist. My breath caught, for here at last was the embodiment of the menace which had so long hovered unseen about the household. Holmes, his figure springing suddenly from the shadows, moved to intercept him, and the stillness of the night was shattered by the sharp clash of the struggle which ensued. The sound of wheels upon the gravel announced the approach of a second carriage. Its door was opened, and Mrs. Eleanor Grant, cloaked against the chill, descended with that dignified bearing which no fear could wholly subdue. She had agreed, at Holmes's urging, to play her part in the dangerous stratagem, though I could well perceive the inward courage such a task demanded of her. Scarce had her feet touched the ground when the figure beneath the elm moved swiftly forward. The lantern, set low upon the turf, cast upward shadows grotesque and distorted, so that the assailant seemed for a moment more spectre than man. His arm shot out, fingers crooked as though to clutch her shoulder, while his other hand appeared to conceal some object glinting faintly in the light. "Eleanor!" cried Miss Harcourt from within the carriage, but her warning came too late. The dark shape was upon them, and Mrs. Grant, though resolute, faltered at the suddenness of the attack. In that instant, Holmes sprang from our concealment, moving with the swiftness of a striking hawk. His hand seized the intruder's wrist, and the lantern toppled, rolling upon the ground until its feeble flame guttered low. I rushed forward, scarcely knowing whether to protect the lady or aid my friend, for the struggle had already begun. Mrs. Grant retreated in alarm, while the shadowed figure twisted and writhed in Holmes's grasp, his cloak falling away to reveal the pale outline of his features. The danger, which until then had hovered like a storm cloud, had at last broken in a flash of violence, and the fate of our adversary hung upon the strength and cunning of my companion. The lantern, half extinguished, sent forth but a flickering ray, yet it sufficed to reveal the visage of the man with whom Holmes grappled. To my astonishment, it was none other than Adrian Verner, the gentleman artist, whose name had hovered so persistently in our suspicions. His eyes blazed with the fury of desperation, his lips drawn back in a snarl which distorted his otherwise refined features into a mask of malice. "You cannot stop me," he hissed, straining against Holmes's iron grip. "She shall pay for what she has done." Holmes, calm even in the tumult, replied coldly, "Your performance is over, Mr. Verner. The theatre of terror which you constructed with threats and false alarms ends here, beneath the elm you yourself appointed." The man struggled furiously, endeavouring to wrench free the hand in which I now perceived the gleam of a knife. With a swift motion, Holmes forced his arm upward, causing the weapon to fall harmlessly upon the grass. I leapt forward and secured it, while Mrs. Grant clutched the side of the carriage in silent horror. For a moment, Verner stood revealed, panting, his garments disordered, his face bathed in sweat, yet his bearing still defiant. "You know nothing," he cried. "You cannot prove—" Holmes's voice cut through his protest with quiet authority. "On the contrary, I know all. Your jealousy, your debts, your studio reeking with linseed oil. All have betrayed you. You sought to cloak your crime in mystery, to set brother against sister and servant against mistress, but the brush-strokes of guilt are as indelible as the paint upon your hands." Thus the villain, once a suitor and man of talent, stood exposed as the author of the terrors that had haunted the household. Though unmasked, the artist was not yet subdued. With a sudden twist, he broke partially free, hurling himself upon Holmes with the ferocity of a madman. The two men swayed together beneath the elm, their shadows leaping grotesquely against the ground as they strove for mastery. "Watson!" cried Holmes sharply. and in an instant I was at his side. Werner, though slight of frame, fought with the strength of desperation, his fingers clawing at Holmes's throat while his knee sought to throw him from balance. I grasped his arm, wrenching it backward, and together we forced him to the ground. He writhed beneath us, cursing with a bitterness that spoke more of thwarted ambition than of mere capture. At last, with a final effort, Holmes pinned him by the shoulders while I bound his wrists with my handkerchief. He lay panting, his chest heaving, his eyes glaring at us with impotent rage. "You see, Watson," said Holmes, rising and dusting his hands, "how jealousy, once admitted to the soul, can lend even a feeble man the strength of a giant." Thus secured, the prisoner lay silent, the fight drained from him, while the night closed once more in its heavy silence about us. When the lantern was relit, Holmes bent over the captive and examined his hands with deliberate care. The stains of oil and pigment lay thick upon the skin, ground into every crevice, while the fingers bore the telltale callus of one accustomed to wielding the brush with his left hand. "Here, Watson, is the final proof," said he. "The scent upon the letter, the smudged characters, the theatrical contrivances, all point unerringly to this man. He painted his own downfall as surely as ever he painted canvas." Werner turned his face aside, but his silence was more eloquent than confession. Mrs. Grant, trembling yet resolute, murmured her thanks, while Miss Harcourt clung weeping to her friend. Thus, beneath the ancient elm, the mystery reached its climax, and the hidden hand that had threatened 3 lives was revealed beyond the possibility of doubt. It was with no small sense of relief that Holmes and I found ourselves once more within the familiar precincts of Baker Street, our grim adventure at Hampstead having reached its conclusion. The captured artist, Adrian Werner, had been delivered into the hands of the authorities, there to await the judgment which his crimes so richly merited. For myself, I confess that fatigue weighed heavily upon me, for the long nights of tension, coupled with the violent climax beneath the elm, had taxed both nerve and body. Holmes, however, seemed restored rather than exhausted. He threw himself into his armchair with that air of quiet triumph which I had so often witnessed when a tangled skein had been brought to order by his patient skill. Lighting his pipe, he sat for a while in contemplative silence, the blue smoke curling about his thin features like the vapours of some magician's cauldron. At last he turned to me with a half-smile. "You perceive, Watson, how easily the most elaborate contrivance collapses when one recognises the false strokes with which it is painted. The whole affair, though garbed in shadows, was no more than the petty spite of a jealous man, adorned with such theatricality as his twisted imagination could devise. Thus began that calm recital of deduction, which, to my mind, remains as fascinating as the adventure itself. You will recall, Watson," said Holmes, "that my earliest suspicion was directed less to the letter's words than to the medium in which they were conveyed. The paper was of foreign manufacture, and the ink, of cheap and viscous quality, betrayed an impatient hand. Most significant of all was the smudging of the characters, always to the right of the stroke. From this, I deduced that the writer employed his left hand, which, moving across the still wet ink, carried the smear onward. Now, left-handedness, while not rare, is sufficiently distinctive to narrow the field when combined with other signs. You may remember that I detected upon the letter a faint odour of linseed oil, so faint indeed that only long familiarity with the substance could have rendered it recognisable. Linseed oil, Watson, is the very lifeblood of the painter's art. When I observed that Mr. Werner's fingers were perpetually stained with pigment and bore the habitual callus of brushwork, the inference became irresistible. Thus the very tools of his trade, his oils, his paper, his careless hand, spoke louder than any confession. The man had endeavoured to cloak himself in shadows, yet the marks of his calling clung to him indelibly. An artist he was, and it was as an artist that he betrayed himself. I could not but marvel at the delicate chain by which Holmes had traced so damning a conclusion from what to me appeared the most trifling of particulars. Holmes continued, leaning forward with that gleam in his eye which bespoke both satisfaction and scorn. Consider, Watson, the sequence of disturbances which so alarmed the household. The slashed curtain, the extinguished lantern, the missing brooch. Each was designed less to inflict harm than to inspire dread. Our adversary sought to weave a drama of menace, to convince his victims that some unseen phantom hovered about their dwelling. Nor did he rest content with mere fright. By directing suspicion toward Henry Morton, the estranged brother, he aimed to fracture the unity of the three ladies. The bitter tongue of Morton, his late-night absences, his ill temper, all these provided the very material upon which Verner built his stage. Had we been less cautious, we might have fallen wholly into the snare, and the women, torn by mistrust, would have stood helpless before the assassin's blow. The threatening letters, couched in melodramatic phrase, were but the overture to this sinister play. Note the phrase, "One among the three shall not live to see the month's end." It is at once vague and terrible, precisely calculated to unsettle without revealing intent. Such flourishes are the hallmark, not of the hardened criminal, but of the man who craves effect, who relishes the spectacle of his own cunning. In short, of an artist. He spoke with such quiet conviction that I could not doubt the truth of his analysis. The very incidents which had bewildered me were, in Holmes's hands, transformed into a coherent and inevitable design. Holmes leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled before him, and continued in that deliberate tone which never failed to hold me captive. The motives of Mr. Verner were as plain as the brushstrokes upon his canvas, once one had pieced them together. You see, Watson, he had cherished a violent and unrequited passion for Mrs. Grant in her widowhood, a passion that soured into hatred when she rejected his advances. Rebuffed in affection, he turned his covetous gaze upon the security which her modest fortune afforded. Yet, to his chagrin, the arrangement of her affairs left him no avenue for advantage. The household, supported by Eleanor's resources, offered him no hold. Clara's small inheritance, guided by the solicitor Fenwick, eluded his reach, and Lydia's gentler nature inspired sympathy, but no profit. Thus Verner conceived the double purpose, to wreak vengeance upon the woman who had scorned him, and at the same time to remove one of the three, thereby creating confusion in which he might sow his claims. His intention, had it succeeded, was to cast suspicion upon Henry Morton, thereby ensuring both the disgrace of the family and his own. Concealment. In this we see the blend of the personal and the pecuniary, of passion and calculation. A rejected suitor, embittered by poverty and pride, finds in his art both the instrument and the betrayal of his crime. It is a tragedy, Watson, but one as old as mankind, that the desire of possession, whether of love or of wealth, should lead a man to ruin. I could not but acknowledge the sombre truth of Holmes's analysis, for Verner's downfall seemed indeed the natural fruit of jealousy entwined with greed. Holmes rose and paced slowly across the room, his voice deepening as he spoke, as though he addressed less myself than some invisible tribunal of reason. Jealousy, Watson, is among the darkest canvases upon which the human mind may paint. It begins with a wounded vanity, a sense that one's rightful due has been withheld, and from that seed springs a poison which no logic can expel. In Verner, we observed its perfect expression. Rejected in love, he could not rest until he had transformed his disappointment into malice. Thwarted in ambition, he sought to degrade those whose independence rebuked his failure. Mark, too, the artistry of his cruelty. He did not strike at once. Instead, he rehearsed his act in a succession of sinister tableaux. The slashed curtain, the extinguished lantern, the stolen brooch, all calculated to unnerve and to dominate. The crime became for him not merely an end, but a performance. That is ever the danger when jealousy seizes the imagination. It feeds upon spectacle, delighting in the fear it evokes. In this, Watson, lies a lesson not only in criminology, but in human frailty. The passions that elevate man may also degrade him. the same sensibility that inspires beauty upon the canvas may conjure horrors in life. Jealousy is no mere sentiment. It is a consuming fire which, once kindled, spares neither victim nor perpetrator. I listened, struck as always by the depth of my friend's reflections, which pierced beyond the individual case to the universal principles beneath. Some days later, Holmes and I paid a final call upon the Hampstead household. The shadow that had so long oppressed those rooms seemed at last dispelled, and the air of quiet dignity which befitted the dwelling had returned. Clara Ashbury met us with tears of gratitude, pressing Holmes's hand as though he had snatched her from the very jaws of calamity. Lydia Harcourt, though pale, had regained something of her gentle composure, and her eyes, though still haunted, were filled with relief. Mrs. Grant, ever the most resolute of the three, expressed her thanks in measured tones, yet the tremor of her voice betrayed how deeply she had felt the peril. "It is not merely that you preserved us, Mr. Holmes," she said, "but that you restored to us the courage to endure. That, too, is no small gift." Holmes inclined his head gravely, offering little beyond a courteous bow. For him, the satisfaction of duty accomplished was ample reward. Yet as we departed, I could not fail to observe the serenity which had returned to that troubled household, nor the profound gratitude which followed Holmes like a silent benediction. That evening, as we sat once more in our familiar chairs by the fire, I ventured to remark upon the strange mingling of love, envy, and greed which had driven Werner to his ruin. Holmes, after a long silence, replied in that reflective tone which was peculiarly his own. "Obsessions, Watson, are but ambitions turned inward. The man who cannot govern his passions becomes their servant, and in serving them, he forfeits his freedom. Werner sought to command both affection and fortune, and failing in each, he surrendered himself to envy. His downfall was therefore not accidental, but inevitable. He might as well have painted his own portrait with the brush of fate." He drew upon his pipe, the smoke wreathing about him in ghostly spirals. "Mark it well, genius, when misapplied, may create as much destruction as it does beauty. There is no blade so keen as the imagination when it turns upon its possessor." I made no reply, for the weight of his words impressed me deeply. Thus ended the affair of the three ladies of Hampstead, a case which revealed at once the brilliance of Holmes's deduction and the tragic perils of a heart enslaved by jealousy. Holmes sat back in his chair, the glow of the fire casting long shadows across his face. "You see, Watson," he said quietly, "jealousy is not content to wound alone. It must parade itself in spectacle, turning life into theatre, until the actor finds himself undone by the very drama he has staged. Our artist painted his doom with the same hand that guided his brush. And now, I turn to you. What do you think was the criminal's greatest mistake? His reckless attempt at murder, or his careless traces of linseed oil and paint? Share your thoughts below, and if you found this mystery as intriguing as we did, be sure to comment, subscribe, and share it with those who love the art of deduction. Another case awaits, and Holmes is never long without a riddle to solve.